The sound of rushing water jolted me awake at exactly 3 a.m. that Tuesday. But it wasn't the calming ripple of Lake Serenity I'd come to love over the years. No, this was louder, more violent. Through my bedroom window, I could see beams of flashlight flickering wildly through the dark. My neighbors were scrambling, dragging out sandbags and salvaging what they could. Water was surging into basements along the eastern shore, rising fast. Over the chaos, one voice cut through like a siren, sharp, shrill, and unmistakable. Karen Peton, president of our HOA, was screaming that someone must have sabotaged the lake. But it wasn't sabotage. The truth was far more unsettling. Karen had caused this flood herself. Let me take you back 3 months to when all of this started. I've lived in the Pine Ridge community for 15 years, in a simple lakeside cabin my grandfather built in the 1960s. Lake Serenity was our pride and joy, a pristine, 20-acre stretch of water surrounded by aging oaks and private cabins. Most of us had docks that extended into the lake, many built decades ago when the original developers encouraged lake access as a selling point. Everything changed when Karen Peton became HOA president last spring. She was a relatively new face in Pine Ridge, having moved in just 2 years prior. But she hadn't bought just one home. She purchased 3 neighboring cabins and turned them into upscale vacation rentals. From the moment she took office, she made it clear she had big plans. Her campaign slogan had been about restoring Pine Ridge to its former glory, though no one could quite figure out what that meant. We've been doing just fine for half a century. Her first official act as president? Digging up the HOA bylaws from 1972. That's when she found a long-forgotten clause about structures extending into the lake. According to her interpretation, any dock built after 1975 required special HOA approval, along with documentation most longtime residents hadn't seen in 40 years. She wasted no time. Violation notices went out to nearly 2/3 of lakefront homeowners. Produce the permits, or tear down your docks within 30 days. Naturally, the community was outraged. At the next HOA meeting, the clubhouse overflowed with angry residents. During the public comment session, I introduced myself, 25 years of experience as an environmental engineer, specializing in watershed management. I explained calmly that these docks had existed for decades without harming the lake, and removing them could actually destabilize the shoreline and do more harm than good. Karen's response was as dismissive as it was smug. She pushed up her designer glasses and smiled that saccharine smile she always wore when she thought she was being clever. "Well," she said sweetly, "the rules are the rules. Maybe you should have considered that before buying property in a community governed by an HOA. Then she dropped the bombshell. She wasn't going to wait for people to comply individually. She had a better idea. She said a more elegant solution. She would lower the lake, drain part of it, to be exact, restore the shoreline to what it had been in 1972. The room erupted. Tom Garrett, whose family had lived here for 3 generations, stood up and warned that draining the lake would devastate the fish population and wreck the ecosystem. Sarah Kingston, a retired attorney, asked whether the HOA even had the legal authority to tamper with a natural water source. But Karen came prepared. She held up a glossy report from a dubious water management firm claiming that partial drainage was a standard maintenance practice that would improve water quality. I knew instantly it was junk science. After the meeting, I pulled aside a few board members and gave them the real story. The hydrology of Lake Serenity was incredibly sensitive. It was sustained by underground springs and seasonal runoff, with a carefully calibrated outflow through a narrow creek at the north end. You can't just drop the water level without triggering unintended consequences: erosion, flooding, even groundwater shifts. But Karen didn't care. She managed to convince 2 other board members, newcomers like her, who also own vacation rentals, that draining the lake would make the shoreline more uniform and increase property values. The vote passed 3-2. The drainage was scheduled for early September, when lake levels were supposedly at their lowest. None of us could have predicted how quickly things would spiral out of control. The next 2 weeks were a blur of documentation and damage control. I took high-resolution photos of the lake's waterline marked dock positions with GPS, and even hired a licensed surveyor to map the existing shoreline. I wasn't going to let Karen Peton rewrite 50 years of natural equilibrium without a fight. I filed a formal written protest with the HOA board and CC'd the State Department of Natural Resources, along with the County Water Management District. My letter laid out, in plain and professional terms, the risks of tamper with the lake's hydrology without proper environmental impact studies. No nonsense type. Flipped through the pages, then turned to Karen with a look of utter disgust. Karen's reply came via certified mail, a hallmark of bureaucratic arrogance. In it, she accused me of fear-mongering and deliberately undermining HOA authority. She closed with veiled threat, implying my own dock might be subject to further review if I continued to stir up trouble. I didn't flinch. I wasn't about to be intimidated by someone who thought a 2-year real estate license mayor qualified to manage a watershed. The so-called restoration began on September 5th. Karen had hired a company called Rapid Flow Solutions, which should have set off alarms on name alone. It sounded more like a clogged toilet service than a professional hydrology firm. They rolled in with portable pumps and began siphoning water from Lake Serenity into temporary holding ponds, claiming they'd slowly release it downstream into the creek system. By the third day, the lake had dropped 4 feet. Docks that once floated now jutted out awkwardly over cracked, stinking mudflats. The air reeked of rotting vegetation as long-submerged plants decomposed under the late summer sun. Fish began dying in the shallows. The community was furious. But Karen? She was all smiles. She kept posting upbeat updates on the HOA Facebook page about how beautiful our new uniform shoreline would be. What she didn't factor in was the weather. In the second week of September, something rare hit our region. A tropical depression that stalled overhead, dumping 8 inches of rain in 36 hours. Normally, Lake Serenity could have absorbed the deluge with no problem. Its natural drainage to the northern creek and underground springs would have handled it easily. But not this time. Not with the lake's balance thrown off and the outflow paths disrupted. What we had now was a time bomb. I first noticed it on the evening of September 14th, a Wednesday. The creek that normally carried overflow out of the lake, it was running backward. The rain had overwhelmed the lower watershed, and instead of draining out, water was being pushed into the lake basin. With the lake level already artificially low, the surrounding terrain, higher, steeper, was now funneling runoff straight toward us. I called the HOA emergency hotline, straight to voicemail. Next, I dialed Karen's cell. She reluctantly shared at a past meeting. She picked up on the 5th ring, her voice already annoyed. I calmly explained the situation, using terms simple enough even she could understand. The lake had become a catch basin. The normal outflows were blocked or disrupted, and now the water was rising fast and unpredictably. We needed to stop the pumps immediately and activate emergency spillways, if any even still worked. Her response? Exactly what I feared. She accused me of exaggerating to sabotage her project, claimed the drainage company had already accounted for rain scenarios, and told me to stop pretending I knew more than professionals she'd hired. Then she hung up. That night, I moved everything valuable to the 2nd floor of my cabin and helped several elderly neighbors do the same. I didn't sleep. By morning, the lake had surged 6 feet in just 8 hours, but it didn't rise evenly. With the lake's natural hydrology shattered, the water rushed toward the eastern shore, the lowest point in the basin. And what property sat right there? Karen's 3 lakeside rental cabins, newly renovated, finished basements, thousands of dollars in designer furnishings. The scene that morning was chaos. Water was pouring into lower levels of over a dozen properties, but Karen's cabins were ground zero. Her tenants, vacationing families and corporate travelers, were evacuating in a panic. Furniture floated in dirty, rising water. Hardwood floors buckled and peeled. And there was Karen, knee-deep in floodwater, mascara streaking down her face, screaming into her phone at the drainage company. The fire department arrived first, followed closely by the county emergency management team. Their first question was simple. Who's responsible for lowering the lake? Every head turned toward Karen. When the officials arrived, I handed them everything: my photos, survey data, copies of emails, and the formal protest I'd submitted weeks prior. Captain Rodriguez, the fire chief, and an SD. By noon, insurance adjusters were combing through the wreckage. The early estimates were staggering. Over $2 million in property damage, not even counting the environmental costs. That afternoon, the state's Department of Natural Resources showed up, and they were livid. Tampering with a natural water body without the proper permits was a serious violation. The fact that it had led to property destruction made it worse. Much worse. An emergency HOA meeting was called that evening. The clubhouse was packed. Standing room only. Residents, many still in damp clothes, demanded answers. Karen tried to hold her ground. She blamed the flooding on an act of God, insisting no one could have predicted it. That's when I stood and presented the evidence. Emails where she was warned repeatedly. HOA meeting minutes where she dismissed expert concerns. The contract with Rapid Flow Solutions, which conveniently included a clause excluding liability for weather-related events. The room erupted. Tom Garrett rose to make a motion, a vote of no confidence in Karen's leadership. Sarah Kingston seconded it. The vote was unanimous. Even her former allies turned their backs. Effective immediately, Karen Peton was removed as HOA president, but her troubles were just beginning. 2 weeks later, the State Water Agency released the results of their investigation. 3 environmental regulations violated, fines totaling $75,000. Personal liability for the full cost of the illegal drainage and all necessary restoration, estimated at $100,000. Karen's insurance provider, after reviewing the documentation and the warning she'd ignored, denied her claim outright. Then came the lawsuits. By October, every flooded property owner had filed suit. Her own tenants, families who lost luggage, electronics, and ruined vacations, joined in. The total civil claim surpassed $500,000. Her attorney, likely the only person still willing to return her calls, strongly advised her to settle before criminal charges entered the conversation. At the next regular HOA meeting, I was elected to the board. I was put in charge of restoring Lake Serenity. We brought in a legitimate environmental firm. Their plan was meticulous and expensive. Rebalance the watershed, replant shoreline vegetation, restock fish, re-engineer outflow systems to prevent future disasters. It would take months to repair what Karen had damaged in mere weeks. 3 weeks after the flood, while knee-deep in restoration logistics, I received a forwarded email from one of Karen's former tenants. They were formally demanding $8,000 in flood damages. Attached was a photo that stopped me cold, and then made me laugh out loud. Floating in the muddy water that had engulfed Karen's rental was a laminated HOA sign, face up, ironically pristine. It read, "No unauthorized docks allowed." The very sign Karen had ordered posted around the lake just months earlier. In the end, the total fallout was devastating for her. $700,000 in fines, settlements, and restoration costs. All 3 rental properties sold off at a loss. Word spread that the state had revoked her real estate license after reviewing her conduct. At her final court hearing, when the judge read the full list of penalties, Karen went pale. She stammered something about being unfairly targeted before her lawyer quietly urged her to stop talking. That was the last anyone in Pine Ridge ever saw of Karen Peton.